This story is about how fear hides in the ordinary, and that the scariest facts are those that no one invented. In the 90s, Moscow experienced a series of mysterious disappearances of teenagers. Only years later did one of the most chilling details emerge. An investigator, dismissed for service violations, kept a personal diary. In it, he meticulously documented his observations of the disappearances and described how someone utilized basement spaces near metro stations. The diary was found in his rented apartment after his death from an overdose. One entry, dated October 1996, concluded with the peculiar phrase, "They know who is making noise in the ventilation, but they are afraid to check." The case was not publicized. Officially, the diary was deemed the fabrication of an unstable individual. However, in 2003, workers discovered a bricked-up ventilation shaft in the basement of an abandoned grocery store on Sushevka. Inside, they found rusty brackets, remnants of clothing, and a tag from a school backpack. No comments were issued. Fact 2. A box of magnetic tape reels, handwritten as Sleep Audio Analysis, Sector C, 1965, was kept in the archives of Leningrad State University for a long time. When the laboratory was disbanded in the 2000s, there was a plan to dispose of the tapes. However, one of the employees decided to digitize them for her family archive, as her father, a physiologist, was named on the back of the box. The audio files contain breathing, rustling sounds, and snoring. Then, fragmented voices begin, as if whispering simultaneously in several languages. Particularly frightening is the recording from the 16th reel. At the 7-minute and 40-second mark, a man suddenly exclaims clearly, "He is standing over me. He doesn't know I can hear him," followed by a dull thud, and then silence. The documents accompanying the tapes do not specify who was recorded or how the experiment was conducted. All participants are long dead. The digitized version disappeared from the internet a week after its publication. None of the academics provided any comments. Fact 3. In the village of Beryozovka, Tomsk Oblast, from the late 80s to the early 2000s, fresh children's toys were found every spring in the local cemetery: plush bears, wind-up cars, dolls in homemade dresses. Not a single burial during these years was connected to children. Elderly residents claimed that at the beginning of the century, there was a mass grave from the Civil War in this place, where, according to legend, a group of refugees, including 5 children, was buried. No one knew exactly where. An inspector on duty in 2003 attempted to install surveillance cameras, but for 3 consecutive nights, the equipment consistently malfunctioned. Batteries died and lenses fogged up from the inside. After a short note was published in the district newspaper, enthusiast tourists came to the village, but that same spring, the toys stopped appearing. Locals said they were taken back. Fact 4. The museum in the closed city of Ozersk, Chelyabinsk region, housed an unusual exhibit, an unmarked iron suitcase. It was found at the edge of a forest belt near the Mayak plant in 1984. It took a week to open it. Inside, there were lead plates wrapped in fiberglass cloth and a notebook with a charred cover. On one spread, there was a pencil inscription, "I took them into myself. Let no one touch them." The radiation level inside the suitcase was tens of times higher than permissible, yet the body itself remained cold and visually undamaged. The notebook was destroyed according to protocol, but one of the museum workers made photocopies, which he allegedly kept at home. He died in 2002 from a rare type of blood cancer. Before his death, he managed to pass a floppy disk to a colleague, but upon attempting to copy it, the disk turned out to be completely empty. After this, it was decided to remove the suitcase from the exhibition. Since then, its whereabouts are unknown. Fact 5. In Bashkiria, in a village with a population of less than 1,000 people, teenagers in the 2000s organized a nighttime scare in an abandoned house of culture. The challenge was to see who could last longer in the basement, where, according to rumors, footsteps could be heard. One day, a seventh grader named Artyom did not return on time. 2 hours later, he was found sitting in a corner, pale, trembling, and silent. Doctors diagnosed him with temporary catalepsy due to acute psychosis. Later, he told his mother a single phrase, "I heard my voice calling me." The basement was inspected, but no traces of other people or acoustic anomalies were found. However, the report compiled by engineers contained a strange pencil note. Echo of speech present, not registered by microphone, source not identified. In 2009, the House of Culture was demolished. To this day, nothing is built on its former site in the village. People say that equipment breaks down as soon as it touches the old foundation. Fact 6. In 1972, within the Semipalatinkinsk test site in Kazakhstan, covert observations were conducted to study the effects of radiation on animal behavior. One report, declassified and archived after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, details an experiment involving a group of rats. These rats were housed in a sealed bunker under a low but stable radiation background. After 9 days, the rats began constructing repetitive structures from plastic fragments and wire, notably resembling radio communication antennas in their shape. A subsequent experiment conducted elsewhere did not yield the same outcome. A scientific consultant noted in a memo, "They seemed to be catching something. We couldn't hear it." The research was halted. All materials were confiscated and sent to an unknown destination. Original reports are missing, with only a microfilm copy surviving. Fact 7. In 1998, the security guard of an archive at a military academy in the Moscow region discovered a peculiar metal box in the basement. It contained several sealed envelopes labeled "Instructions for Exiting Sleep." The box was not listed in any inventory, despite bearing a Ministry of Defense seal from the 1960s. One envelope was opened, revealing a sheet with instructions for actions in case of repeatedly returning to the same gay. Among the listed steps were, do not look in the mirror after 4:40 p.m., avoid the window in the corridor between the 3rd and 4th minute, and, if orientation is lost, lie on the floor and wait for a signal. The papers were confiscated. Officially, it was attributed to a prank or a mistake. However, the guard was dismissed without explanation, and he later told neighbors that he was still seeing that day. 2 years later, he disappeared, and dozens of identically dated calendars were found in his apartment. Fact 8. At an old radar station on the shore of Lake Wonaga, decommissioned after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a faint radio signal began to appear in the 2000s. The band was unstable, appearing between 2 and 3 in the morning, with the text being a looped sequence of numbers resembling one-time pads. On one of these days, the signal was successfully deciphered, resulting in a text fragment similar to an excerpt from an interrogation. It featured a person named Stepan, who claimed to be living in the 25th repetition and to know who is transmitting instructions. The file caused a stir among radio enthusiasts, but disappeared from forums within 24 hours. One user who posted the recording later reported that their account was deleted and their home equipment was damaged without any signs of forced entry. Official services ignored the inquiries, even though unscheduled geophysical monitoring was being conducted in the station's vicinity during that period. The reason for this was not explained. Fact 9. During an inspection in 1988, after the disaster at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, a videotape was found on one of the stations of the 4th power unit. The recording was made on the day of the accident. The tape shows a standard image from a surveillance camera, the control room, 2 operators, everything as it should be. However, starting from the 9th minute, a dark, indistinct spot appears in the right corner of the frame. As events unfold, the spot becomes brighter, resembling a glow. Notably, despite deteriorating conditions, the camera continues to operate and record without any failures. A minute before the communication cutoff, both operators simultaneously turn their heads towards this glow. even though, judging by the angle, it was outside their field of vision. The recording only captures the hum of ventilation and a single short sound resembling a click. An attempt was made to digitize the tape, but it reportedly melted during loading into the equipment. The only copy was destroyed in the archive department during a fire in 2001, the cause of which remains unestablished. Fact 10. In 1974, in the Krasnoyarsk Krai, in a village not marked on tourist maps, a local schoolboy drew a dream map on the club's wall, as he himself called it. The map depicted a house, 12 identical corridors, and a figure resembling a person without a face. The map had arrows indicating a route and the inscription, "If you go out the door, do not return, he is already near." In the morning, the drawing was painted over. But after 3 days, 2 more children who did not know about the drawing began to complain to their parents that everything is repeating and at night there are identical stairs. One described a figure waiting behind the 4th door. Doctors diagnosed acute sleep disorder. The family of the boy who started it all left urgently, and soon the house where they lived burned down. The cause of the fire was not found. The club building has since been attempted to be reconstructed several times, but each time something interfered. One worker was hospitalized after a fall. Another broke his arm on an empty staircase. Locals do not like to recall this. Fact 11. In 1983, a Soviet geological survey party in the Commander Islands region recorded a seismic signal unlike any known natural or artificial impulse. The signal originated from a depth exceeding 25 kilometers, which contradicted the capabilities of the equipment at that time. The pulse's frequency repeated every 37 seconds. Over 3 days, it slowly shifted upwards, as if someone were adjusting the transmitter. One specialist proposed a hypothesis about a deep cavity, but in a private conversation admitted to a colleague that it sounds like a countdown. The signal ceased a week later. However, in 2012, American oceanographers detected very similar pulses, again in the Kamchatka region. The coincidence of frequencies and amplitudes was almost complete. This sparked brief interest in academic circles, but the topic disappeared from the agenda as quickly as it emerged. A legend among geologists states that the signal repeats every 29 years. The next occurrence is expected in 2041. Fact 12. In the late 1960s, in Odessa, at house number 7 on Osipova Street, inexplicable power outages began to occur. This affected only one apartment and happened exclusively at night. The lamps would go out, even if they were new. Electricians checked the wiring, and everything was normal. Then, the residents started leaving their radio receivers on. However, precisely at 2:47 a.m. every night, a loud beep was heard on the air, after which silence fell in the room and the lights went out. The apartment owner, a former chemistry teacher, began keeping a diary. In one entry, she wrote, "Yesterday, I heard someone speaking from the socket. Not words, just a feeling, as if someone was waiting for me to look around." 3 months later, the woman disappeared. The door was locked from the inside, and no signs of a struggle were found. The diary remained in the apartment. The last entry consisted of just 2 words, "He's out." The building was vacated in 1980. Now there is a new building there. People complain about strange malfunctions with smart lamps. Fact 13. In the archives of a school in the Sverdlovsk region, a strange class register from 1971 has been preserved. It lists a student by the surname V. Filipov, who attended almost all classes. However, he is not in the graduation lists. No photographs remain, and in the classmates' questionnaires, there is a blank line instead of his surname. The teacher, who taught mathematics and passed away in the 90s, mentioned in letters to a relative, "There is one boy. He always sits by the window, but for some reason does not respond to roll call, although he is always in class." The archivist who was involved in digitization decided to recheck the data and discovered that in all the records where Filipov was mentioned, the text differs slightly in font, as if added later. On an old class photograph, there is indeed one unaccounted for silhouette in the last row. It is blurry but clearly human. The photo was sent for examination. The conclusion, no signs of manipulation. The school building was demolished in 2007. In its place, a new building houses a computer class where dates on computers regularly reset. This happens in only one room. Fact 14. During the final months of the war at the Kaliber plant in Moscow, an engineer named Viktor Karpukhin began keeping a personal journal documenting unusual equipment malfunctions. He reported that machine parts would spontaneously shift at night, and by morning, handprints of children's size would appear on the metal panels. The entries were written in a dry, technical language, devoid of excessive emotion. The last page, dated December 1944, stated, "Woke up again today. Someone walked through the workshop. 5 steps, 2 seconds, silence. I didn't call them." Following this entry, Karpukhin disappeared. Officially, he was listed as missing. His desk was sealed, and the journal got lost among technical documentation. It resurfaced only in 2016 when the building was being renovated into a business center, and the archive was transferred to a private library. 3 employees who worked in the former workshop number 4 complained of knocks in the ventilation, particularly at night. One employee resigned, leaving a note. "I hear someone breathing behind the partition. Every evening, it's empty there." Fact 15. In one of the pre-trial detention cells in Vorkuta in 1966, a strange inmate appeared. He had no documents and refused to give his name, but according to the duty officer, he behaved politely and was remarkably calm. After 24 hours, he disappeared. The cell was locked from the inside and no signs of escape were found. An inscription remained on the wall. "Thank you for the reception. I will return if my call is not heard." An investigation was launched, but the case was quickly closed to avoid scandal. The duty officer who processed him later wrote an anonymous letter to the district department stating, "He knew how our door opened, even though it was a new lock. He did not blink once during the entire interrogation, and he spoke as if he had been sitting here for a long time." The inmate's handwriting matched an inscription on the wall of a temporary camp from the 30s, which read, "I will return at 40 if no one opens." The cell was dismantled during renovations, but guards still call it the polite room. The 16th fact concerns an event that occurred on the Black Sea coast in 1988. Fishermen found wreckage of a lifeboat with the inscription Caspian 17. This name was not listed in any ship registry. Inside, they found a wet backpack, a rusty thermos, and a notebook. The entries were heavily water damaged, but one page remained. On it, written by what appeared to be an adult man's hand, was, "They are coming from below. The waves are not carrying us, but pressing. We are returning, but there is no shore." An expert examination determined that the ink was of a 1950s Army sample. The lifeboat's sail was better preserved than the other parts. It was given to a museum, but after 6 months, the fabric unexpectedly darkened and began to emit a faint smell of burning. Museum staff decided to burn it, fearing contamination. However, 2 years later, a local newspaper reported that another piece of wreckage was found in the estuary of the same river, a thermos lid with the same engraving. Since then, no more wreckage has been found. Nevertheless, fishermen still tell stories about black water that sometimes knocks from below against their boats. Fact 17. In the early 90s, in Podolsk, a sealed box was found at a warehouse of decommissioned photographic equipment. It contained 10 identical Zenit cameras, each with a serial number not registered in any records. One of the students, an intern, took a camera for himself. The resulting photos were blurry, with distortions even when shooting in daylight. However, if a shot was taken exactly at midnight, the image was clear and sharp, and the center of the picture always featured the same figure. At a distance, in the background of the frame, stood a person in a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. Their face was not visible. Attempts to photograph in different locations yielded the same outcome. After 8 such photographs, the student burned the films but couldn't save the camera, as it was stolen from his apartment. 6 months later, the student disappeared. Neighbors reported hearing him cry out at night, "He is closer." A year later, a similar camera with the same serial numbers surfaced at a flea market in Yaroslav. Its new owner vanished 3 weeks later. Fact 18. In 1959, in the Novgorod region, while laying a power line, a team of workers came across an old, clearly pre-war concrete well that was completely filled with concrete. After removing the top slab, a vertical shaft was found inside. Metal brackets were hammered into its walls, resembling a ladder. At a depth of about 20 meters, there was a metal door that could not be opened. After 24 hours, the well was refilled, and the papers describing the find were sent to Moscow. However, one of the engineers, named Kokloff, kept copies for himself. His notes indicated that the door rang when tapped. A month later, Kokloff disappeared. The folder with the materials ended up with his daughter, who published excerpts online in 2004. According to her, her father left a note. "Behind this door is emptiness, but the emptiness hums." This post became an internet legend, and the authenticity of the records was confirmed by archivists. The well is now filled in, but a smooth circle is visible on the satellite image, where grass does not grow even in summer. Fact 19. In a Moscow apartment, located in a Stalin-era building on Vernadsky Avenue, since the early 2000s, the ceiling light would blink every day at the same time, 4:11 a.m., even when it was switched off. Electricians were baffled, finding no issues with the wiring or the circuit breaker. The family decided to install a night vision camera. On the second night, the camera captured a strange exposure spike, as if someone had rushed past the lens. When reviewed frame by frame, one frame showed a blurry figure standing by the door. No shadows or light fell on it. 2 weeks later, the apartment owner began complaining about a recurring dream. "I open the door and see myself standing outside." After consulting a psychologist, the dream stopped, but the light continued to blink. A year later, the residents moved out. The new inhabitants noticed nothing unusual, except for one thing. Their doorbell has never worked. Neither the old nor the new one. Not a single button. Never. Fact 20. In the 70s, in the Tumen region, forest rangers reported a strange discovery. In the middle of the forest stood a wooden table with 3 chairs, clearly man-made, but blackened by time. On the table was a lamp connected to nothing. The wire went into the ground. They checked, there was no electricity. Upon closer inspection, the chairs turned out to be made from twisted tree roots, but without any signs of sawing. One of the forest rangers, Ivanov, photographed the find, but the picture showed nothing, only grass. He decided to return, but couldn't find the spot, despite having precise coordinates. A week later, he was found 2 kilometers away, without shoes, with burnt palms, and repeating a phrase until he lost consciousness. "I was sitting in my place, and someone was watching. Ivanov no longer worked in the forest. And the tree trunks in that square are still slightly tilted inwards, as if something heavy was pressing from the center. Fact 21st. In 1966, at a military radio station in the Khabarovsk Krai, an operator recorded a strange signal. This signal repeated with a precise frequency, exactly 66 beats per minute. Initially, it was thought to be equipment malfunction. However, the signal persisted, and according to the duty officer, it was felt less by hearing and more within the chest, as if it were not your heart beating nearby. It lasted for 4 consecutive nights, always from 2 a.m. to 2:11 a.m. On the 5th night, everything stopped. But exactly 1 year and 1 day later, the signal returned. This time it was twice as strong, with an indistinct low hum at the beginning. One of the radio engineers recorded it on a reel and sent it to Moscow. No response was received. 2 months later, he committed suicide. In his note, he wrote, "It knocked from the other side. I couldn't stand it." The reel disappeared without a trace. And in a technical journal, someone added in pencil, twice 66, and no more breathing. Fact 22nd. In a Vladivostok hospital, in room number 9, a patient complained that every night she was awakened by a smell of water. Doctors paid no attention, but the night nurse began to notice a strangeness. At 3:12 a.m., a damp spot appeared on the ceiling, as if from a leak, even though there was an empty attic above the room. An inspection revealed that the ceiling was dry. 3 nights later, the patient died of a heart attack. Before her death, she managed to say, "I realized it wasn't water, it's him breathing through the ceiling." After her death, the room was sealed, but the spot reappeared. It was painted over, plastered, but each time it returned to the same place, at the exact same time. Eventually, the ceiling was dismantled, and a wooden beam was found with nails from an old suspended floor. On one of the nails was a shred of rope, and nearby was carved, "Do not wake me while it is dry." The beam was removed and taken away. The spot stopped appearing until the night when plumbers accidentally looked into the room. They said it smelled like a pond and something else. Fact 23rd. During a routine inventory in 1987 at a printing house warehouse in Yaroslav, a box with unaccounted copies of a book without a title was found. The book had a dark gray cover, and the spine only bore the numbers 2031. Upon opening the first page, a worker saw a list of names and dates. He assumed it was a defective print run, but as he read further, he noticed his own surname. Next to it was the date of his death, 2 days away. The book immediately disappeared. Rumor has it it was taken by people from the management. 2 days later, the worker indeed died in an accident on his way to work. Later, another employee claimed to have seen a similar book in the attic. It seemed to update itself, with new lines appearing when opened. In 1991, the building burned down. Officially, it was due to electrical malfunction. But the fire started from that very attic where the book was allegedly located. One of the firefighters, sifting through the ashes, found a corner of a burnt page with an incomplete phrase, "If you read it, the term has begun." He kept this paper as an amulet. A year later, he also died. His time coincided. Fact 24th. In the early 2000s, in Kaliningrad, within a private apartment, a family began to notice their dreams coinciding. The husband, wife, and their daughter, all three dreamt of the same house, a staircase, an empty room, and a shadow behind a glass door. Initially, they dismissed it as coincidence, but one morning, the daughter said, "He's gotten closer. He's at the door. He says, don't open it." The mother, frightened, started writing down all the dreams. They repeated with the precise placement of objects. In one of the dreams, the door opened. In the morning, the girl did not wake up. Doctors could not determine the cause. Her body was normal, but her heart stopped. The mother stopped writing, but the father, in despair, returned to them. A month later, he disappeared. He didn't come home from work, and there were no signs of a break-in. Only his note, torn from a notebook, remained. "I opened the door. He knows I remember." The apartment has been rented out infrequently since then. Those who live there sometimes complain about strange mirror-like spots on the wallpaper and the sound of footsteps at night, even though it's the top floor. Fact 25th. In 1979, at Loknya Station in the Pskov region, a strange incident occurred. A freight train, moving without violations according to schedule, suddenly stopped in the middle of a forest. The engineer claimed that a person in long dark clothing appeared on the tracks and, not wanting to hit them, he applied emergency braking. An inspection revealed no one on the tracks, nor any traces or signs of recent presence. However, the rails at this spot were noticeably colder than the rest of the track, as if the metal links had recently been cooled to 0 degrees Celsius. The engineer conducting the inspection froze his hand touching the surface. A couple of days later, the station duty officer reported that an entry had appeared in the movement log, allegedly handwritten by the engineer. "He crossed the rails. Time has begun." The engineer himself claimed he did not write this phrase. The paper was confiscated, but a photograph of the entry, taken by the engineer's phone, surfaced online in the 2010s. Beneath it was a comment. He walks on the sleepers. He doesn't touch every third one. Fact 26th. In Vladivostok, within an abandoned building of an old technical college, construction workers came across a peculiar staircase leading downwards. This staircase was not present on the building's blueprints. It comprised 7 flights of stairs, featured concrete walls, and lacked any finishing. At the lower level, there was a metal door marked with the number 0. There was no electricity in the lower area, yet a surveillance camera lowered there continued to operate without external power for nearly 48 hours. Throughout this entire period, the camera transmitted an image of darkness, occasionally showing faint glints. At the 36th minute of the recording, a sound was heard for the first time, a light, rhythmic tapping, as if someone were ascending the stairs from below. The camera was retrieved, and its recordings disappeared from the hard drive. The remaining fragment, lasting 3 seconds, contains a muffled voice whispering, "We've returned. It's all a cycle." Following the incident, the premises were filled with concrete. However, security guards report that sometimes at night a low hum is heard from beneath the floor, akin to the sound of footsteps in an empty underground space. Fact 27th. In 1964, in Kuibysh, now Samara, a schoolboy named Gennady suddenly began to exhibit phenomenal memory. Within a few days, he memorized the telephone directory, several pages of the legal code, and all city transport schedules. His parents thought it was a surge in abilities, but the boy started writing incomprehensible lines in notebooks, in Old Slavonic, Latin, and partly in German. He claimed he had learned to listen at night, and that if everything is heard correctly, a staircase will open. Doctors attributed this to schizophrenia. However, one of them, who knew ancient languages, noticed a phrase in the boy's writings, "Iterum per scalas," which translates to, "again up the stairs." A week later, the boy disappeared at night from the locked ward. The windows were barred, the doors locked, and the guards were on duty. Cameras recorded nothing. His belongings remained untouched. But on the very last page of his notebook, a short word appeared, written in fresh ink. Gone. Fact 28th. In the year 1988, in the village of Belaya Gora in Komi, loggers found a charred concrete slab lying at the edge of a ravine. The slab was smooth, with a coordinate grid applied to its center and 5 concentric circles. Nearby were a burnt bench and 3 metal cylinders that appeared to be sealed. Upon opening one of the cylinders, the workers discovered a roll of paper with the date December 2029. Another cylinder was found to be empty. The third cylinder could not be opened, even with an oxyacetylene torch. The paper was handed over to the local museum, where it disappeared 2 days later. One of the loggers later began to suffer from panic attacks. He claimed to have seen something resembling a shadow sitting in the circle and heard a voice saying, "You are not the one who was supposed to come." He was sent for treatment. The doctor who worked with him mentioned that the patient knew the precise positions of the stars in the sky for specific dates, including future ones. The slab was later buried. However, satellite images show a strange symmetry of trees around the area, as if the entire forest space is arranged in circles. Fact 29th. In 2015, in Viborg, in the attic of an old house slated for demolition, a box containing dictaphone cassettes was found. The accompanying envelope was labeled Archive of the Night. The tapes held tens of hours of nighttime recordings. Initially, only the creaking of floorboards and distant street sounds were audible. However, starting around the 20th minute of one of the cassettes, phrases began to be heard within the room. It was a whisper, repeating the same words in Russian but distorted, as if in a loop. "You are not yet asleep. He waited for you to blink." Later, crying was heard, followed by clear, cold speech. "He is inside the walls. He always was." Technical analysis confirmed that at the time of recording, the dictaphone was in a closed room, and the phrases were captured not from outside, but as if they originated on the tape itself. The person who digitized the files later stated that they began waking up every night at 3:33 a.m. and seeing a silhouette moving behind the curtains. They left the city. The house where all this was found caught fire before its demolition. The cause was not determined. Fact 30th. In 1991, a plaque was discovered inside the door of an old crypt in a cemetery near Tula. It was nailed there with the inscription, "I am not inside, I am outside, open." The crypt had been sealed in 1952 and had not been opened since. The metal hinges had rusted so badly that the lid had to be cut off. Inside, the crypt was empty. There was no coffin or remains, only a layer of dust and an old flashlight with a dead battery. According to its marking, the flashlight was manufactured in the 1980s. No one could explain how it ended up in the sealed space. A week later, another visitor to the cemetery in an adjacent plot reported seeing a person in a black overcoat walking towards the crypt, looking at the ground. There was no security present at the time, and the cameras were not working. The only thing captured on video that night was a shadow flashing across the frame at 4:44 a.m. The shadow was too tall and indistinct to be human. However, the camera report later disappeared from the archive. In its place, a note was found on a scrap of paper. "Don't write, he is listening." Fact 31. In the early 2000s, cable modernization was carried out at an underground metro station in Kharkiv. One of the electricians, while descending into a technical tunnel, discovered an old passage behind the cladding. This passage led in a direction not marked on any schematic. Deciding to inspect it, he proceeded about 60 meters. The tunnel then abruptly ended in a circular room with rusty doors around its perimeter. The doors would not open, except for one that was slightly ajar. Inside was an empty room with a mirror and a broken wall clock, its hands showing 3:21. The electrician photographed his find, but upon developing the picture, only blackness appeared instead of the mirror, with a faint silhouette of a standing figure in the right corner. Later, he claimed to hear rustling sounds behind his apartment walls and to wake up at 3:21 every night. 2 weeks later, he disappeared. The passage in the tunnel was sealed up again. All mentions of it were erased from the repair reports. However, on a stalking forum, a user with the nickname Door321 posted the phrase, "He is waiting behind the mirror. If you entered, do not turn back." The account was deleted 5 minutes later. Fact 32nd. In the mid-1980s, at a research institute of psychophysiology near Moscow, an experimental method for sleep was developed, involving direct dream stimulation through sound imagery. Volunteers were played sets of sounds: rustling, distant bell ringing, breathing, splashing water. One of the subjects, a young lieutenant, began to complain that the sound now doesn't turn off. He said that even when awake, he heard someone calling his name, and the voice always came from the left and below. Within a month, he stopped sleeping. His eyes were open, his pulse was rapid, but his brain seemed to remain in a sleep phase. Doctors called this phase perception shift. On the last day of the experiment, he suddenly started repeating, "I'm going where the sound was. I understood where it is." He was found dead 3 hours later, sitting in a lotus position with headphones on containing absolute silence. And on the wall nearby, someone had written in pencil, "You listened to something other than what was turned on." The experiment's records disappeared from the archive in 1993. Only the cover remained with the inscription, Step 6. Fact 33rd. During the reconstruction of an old estate near Lviv in 2002, workers discovered a bricked-up room in one of the towers. The walls were plastered with a double layer, and an iron plate was fitted into the doorway. Inside, there was a small square room without windows, containing a half-ruined armchair, a metal tray, and a notebook without a cover. The first entry in it read, "I am a volunteer. They locked me in to check who knocks at 3. The last entry was dated November 1961. The writer reported hearing breathing from the other side of the wall, and that the day repeats itself, only the sounds change places. From the middle of the notebook onwards, the entire text is written in mirror writing. The final line stated, "If you are reading this, it means I did not get out. Do not open the second wall." No other doors were found. A face appeared in the photograph of the bricked-up wall, unclear, like an imprint, as if someone had pressed their forehead against it from the inside. Investigations revealed that the plaster there was almost twice as thick. However, touching it was forbidden. The room was sealed up again, without a plaque. Fact 34th. In St. Petersburg, within an archive of the Ministry of Transport, a file marked Route N0, a null, was discovered in 1997. Inside was a report about a bus line that operated from 1983 to 1985. The bus departed at 11 p.m. from the terminal station near the cemetery and made a circuit along outlying streets that no longer exist, having been demolished due to development. According to the documents, the route was not officially registered, yet the reports listed drivers' surnames, schedules, and waybills. One former conductor, located by journalists, admitted that on a couple of occasions the bus reached a place where there was no road. His words were, "They stood there, faceless, just in trench coats. No one got on, but the doors opened." When asked who they were, he replied, "I don't know, but when one of the drivers didn't arrive, his bus came back to the depot on its own, empty, without a driver." The file was later deleted, but a copy was preserved in a backup database. The last page of the route document bore a pencil inscription: "If you get on after the cemetery, you won't get off until morning. If you get off, you are not you." Fact 35th. During the construction of a new metro station in Yekaterinburg in 2013, an excavator hit a strange metal plate underground. The plate was lifted, revealing it to be the cover of a shaft. Beneath it lay a perfectly round chamber lined with mirror tiles. Its depth was about 15 meters. The bottom was smooth and empty. However, each time a camera was lowered, the sound disappeared. The image transmitted was clear, but without any noise, as if the entire sound spectrum was being jammed. On one attempt, the camera transmitted a frame where a figure, not present in the shot, was reflected in the mirror. It stood to the side, beyond the lens's view. A second later, the broadcast ceased and the equipment failed. The following day, the shaft was filled in. One of the project engineers later disappeared. His last entry in his electronic diary read, "Sound is the mirror. It is in the reflection. Until you hear it, it is safe." The documentation regarding the discovery contained no mention of it. The plate was officially recognized as part of an old storm drain collector. However, no one approached it again. Fact 36th. In a village near Penza during the 1970s, local schoolchildren spoke of a peculiar person who appeared in a field at night. He remained motionless, standing like a post. However, if one blinked or looked away, his position would change. One of the children decided to approach. According to his mother's account, he returned with gray hair. Several years passed, and the story was forgotten. But in 1992, during the reconstruction of an old farmyard, a charred foundation with a staircase leading nowhere was found underground. Above the staircase was a plaque that read, "Where one should not have gone." On the adjacent wall, a child's inscription in charcoal stated, "I went anyway." No documents were found. Only remnants of toys and a rusty school button were discovered. A photograph of the excavation shows a stretched shadow, even though the light that day fell at a right angle. Locals advise against standing in that spot for more than a few seconds, saying that ears begin to ring and vision darkens. It feels as if someone is slowly raising their gaze from below. Fact 37th. In 1980, in Omsk, a music college instructor recorded his students' etudes onto reel-to-reel tape. However, upon listening, he discovered that in the pauses between the exercises, a faint tapping and someone's voice singing the phrase, "He walks for the notes, a shadow between the keys," could be heard. Checks confirmed the recording was clean, without any editing. The students maintained they hadn't heard anything unusual. The next day, the instructor decided to re-record everything. But during the repeated recording, the voice became louder. In one of the tracks, when a student played a wrong note, the tape recorder's sound abruptly stopped, leaving only the phrase, "You played it wrong. Now he has heard." A week later, the instructor disappeared. His reels were found a month later. All the tapes had been cut into identical segments and neatly arranged in the shape of keys. Each had an inscription, seemingly made with blood. "The door opens on E-flat." The tape recorder jammed. The last sound played was a note that the college later banned from use without accompaniment. It was done as if in jest, though the joke was poorly remembered. Fact 38. In 1994, in Cheetah, on the outskirts of the city, a group of teenagers discovered an old wooden carriage. It stood on a detached section of rails, overgrown with grass. Inside the carriage, it was empty, except for a single leather suitcase and a book. The book was blank, with all pages white. The suitcase was locked, without a key. One of the boys, the bravest, took it with him. 3 days later, he began to write his dreams in the blank book. According to him, the dreams repeated every night. He was riding in this carriage, a man in a raincoat sat beside him, and outside the windows was complete darkness. No landscape, no light, only the clatter of wheels. On the 5th night, the boy did not wake up. Doctors could not determine the cause, and on the last written page of the book there was only one line. "We are still riding. He said we would stop soon, but there is no way out." The suitcase was later attempted to be opened. Inside, only earth and a numbered token were found. The carriage was gone from its spot a week later. The rails had rusted. But one night, a sound was heard there again, as if a train was moving, but without light and without a whistle. Fact 39th. During exercises in Karelia in 1972, a group of communication specialists encountered a peculiar interference in the radio channel. This interference consistently occurred at the same time, 0444, and lasted for 1 minute, after which the airwaves returned to normal. The sound resembled a child's whisper mixed with clicks. One of the specialists decided to overlay the signal spectrogram onto a map of the area, resulting in a pattern suspiciously similar to the structure of the barracks they were in. The map indicated a point corresponding to an old storage room. There, they found a wooden box with a lid. Inside lay a military cloak and a note. "If I open my eyes again, send me back." The cloak belonged to a soldier who died in 1944. However, the forensic expert who examined it stated that the fabric was fresh, showing no signs of wear. Furthermore, a tag was sewn onto the lining with a date that had not yet arrived, August 21, 2026. After this signal was published in a military journal in 2001, communications in that area began to fail annually at the exact same minute. For precisely 1 minute, the airwaves were silent, save for a single click, like a step. Fact 40th. In the late 80s, in the suburbs of Voronezh, Dacha residents noticed a damp trail near an old shed every morning. It seemed as if someone was leaving the forest barefoot and approaching the door. However, there were no returning tracks. The shed was old, with a rotten roof, and inside there was only old furniture and bags of trash. One teenager who decided to spend the night there disappeared. He was found 2 days later several kilometers from the plot with blue lips and slurred speech, mumbling, "He wanted me to stay. I saw him waiting under the stairs." There were no stairs in the shed. But when the floor was dismantled, a passage downwards was discovered. The remains of a basement flooded with water. On the concrete wall there was a charcoal inscription. "I didn't call. He came himself. He needs a second one." The passage was boarded up, but 6 months later, vandals broke into the shed again, and one of them later stated that he heard a voice under the boards. No one sleeps there anymore. And the shed door, even when locked, is found ajar again every night by a couple of centimeters. Inward. Fact 41. In 2007, in Nizhny Novgorod, a schoolboy during an excursion to a local history museum accidentally opened a box that was sealed according to regulations. Inside were sheets of thick paper folded in half and a small children's photo album. The photos showed ordinary courtyards, houses, entrances, but all without people. The last picture stood out. A dark corridor with an open elevator in the distance and a ball lying on the floor in front of it. There were no captions. The schoolboy took one sheet with him. It had scratched on it at an angle. "If you found it, it's already coming." A week later, he fell out of his own house window, late at night, in complete silence. His parents claimed he was afraid of elevators and always took the stairs. But on the day of his death, for some reason, he took the elevator to the 8th floor. A downstairs neighbor heard a chime, the door closed and immediately opened again. Someone else's ball was later found on the floor in front of the elevator, a child's, yellow with black stripes. No child in the building had lost such a ball at that time. Fact 42. In Arkhangelsk in 1965, meteorologists recorded a strange flash over the White Sea, dark red, oval-shaped, lasting just over a minute. The signal was also received by a ship within a 20-kilometer radius, and one of the radio operators wrote in the log, "It seemed to be watching. We were blinded for a second." No one paid attention until a month later when a seaplane crashed in the same location. The pilot, before the crash, managed to transmit only 2 words into the air. "He has returned." Everyone perished. The case was closed. However, 40 years later, a microfilm was found in a private archive with a recording of a radiogram from the lighthouse on Cape Korabelny. No one received the radiogram because the frequency was off. It contained coordinates and a short message. "Close your eyes if it gets hot. He is studying." Scientists believe it was an equipment malfunction, but the lighthouse from which the radiogram came was shut down that same night, although officially it was supposed to operate until the end of the year. The reason for the shutdown has not been established. Fact 43. In the Smolensk region, on the grounds of a former hospital closed in 1993, volunteers found a wooden cabinet containing patients' personal files. Most of the papers had rotted away, but one envelope was found to be sealed. Inside was a medical record for a patient surnamed L, admitted in 1981. The diagnosis was nocturnal hallucinations and disturbances in time perception. However, the most peculiar were the daily notes of the attending physician. He wrote that the patient remembered the events of the next day each morning. He knew who would enter the room, what would be said on the radio, which button I would press on the thermometer. After 10 days, L began to claim he could not see through tomorrow. He was being hindered by the one standing behind the glass. On the 11th night, the patient disappeared. The windows and doors were locked. Only on the inside of the glass cabinet was there a forehead print and a short inscription made with a finger. He saw through. The doctor resigned shortly thereafter. The hospital was closed without explanation. The ward walls remained, and on one of them a print mark is still visible, as if pressed into the glass from the inside. Fact 44. In 1988, an equipment malfunction occurred at the city television tower in Samara. One of the channels suddenly began broadcasting a static image of a black staircase leading downwards, accompanied by a countdown. 0009. The broadcast lasted for 30 seconds, after which the image disappeared. No employee admitted to initiating the signal, and no traces of the broadcast were found in the broadcasting equipment. The editorial office received calls with questions throughout the evening, but no official explanation was provided. A week later, one of the technicians responsible for the signal jumped from the same tower. His suicide note contained only the phrase, "I reached zero. It opened." Soon, rumors began to circulate in the city. It was said that on certain nights, if one stood at the base of the television tower with their eyes closed, they could hear the rustle of footsteps on the metal staircase. Someone was climbing. However, the number of footsteps would be one more than expected. Then, a single short knock would sound, followed by silence. And only then should one open their eyes, if they dared. Fact 45th. In Lipetsk, in the early 1990s, an employee of the Central Library discovered a narrow cabinet in the basement that was not listed in the inventories. Inside the cabinet was a stack of books without covers. All pages were blank except for the last page in each book. These pages contained neatly printed names, dates, and the phrase, "You closed your eyes, he managed." Several names matched entries in city obituaries from recent months. One of the librarians, Nikolai K., recorded this find in his personal diary and began to observe if the book would be updated. 3 weeks later, he noticed a new name, his own, with a date 2 days in the future. He tried to disprove this, stayed indoors, cut off the electricity, and locked the doors. But on the night before the specified date, neighbors heard noise from his apartment, and in the morning found him in his chair dead from cardiac arrest. All the books from the cabinet disappeared. Only one page with a new name remained on the floor. Neither the library nor its management conducted further inventory. According to the staff, the cabinet seemed to dissolve into the wall. Fact 46th. In 1976, in the village of Mesherskoye, Moscow Oblast, teenagers found a mirror in a long-closed and semi-ruined wooden church standing by the altar wall. Its surface was dim and covered with dust. One of the boys, according to recollections, approached it and said that there are no clocks in the reflection. A few days later, he began to have seizures. He kept repeating, "They are inside. They don't move while you're looking." The local paramedic, after examining the site, noted that the mirror did not reflect the ceiling, only the walls and the floor. And if one stood to the side, a staircase appeared in the reflection, which did not exist in reality. It led downwards to a place in the church where there was no passage. That same night, the church building partially collapsed. The boy was taken to a psychiatric clinic. He stopped speaking. On his pillow, the orderlies found a shard of mirror glass with the scratched phrase, "They showed me the time. I didn't come back." The church burned down in a mysterious fire 3 months later. The cause could not be determined. There is now a field in that place, but in the summer, the grass there grows in rings. Fact 47th. In 1983, in Novosibirsk, at one of the dormitories for physics students, a sheet with a table was posted on the announcement board. The columns listed time, date, and a single word, transition. No one knew who had hung it. However, one student, Mikhail S., noted that the indicated date, November 14th, 2:16 a.m., coincided with his regular bouts of sleepwalking. He decided to stay awake at this time. According to him, he got out of bed and saw not his reflection in the mirror, but an empty room stretching into the distance. He stepped forward, and at that moment he woke up. He found himself standing in the middle of the street, barefoot, 2 blocks away from the dormitory. A month later, he disappeared. Only the same table with a new date and the signature, next at the bottom, remained in his room. The table was removed, but a few years later, a copy of it reappeared, this time in a different dormitory. It had the same times and a new surname at the bottom. It was checked, and the student whose surname was listed had died in a car accident the following day. The table vanished. No one ever saw who hung it again, but the time always follows the schedule. Fact 48th. In Orenburg in the mid-1990s, an archive worker found a film reel not listed in the catalog. It was labeled Lecture Number 0. The recording shows a dark auditorium with the camera positioned in a corner and a podium visible. Behind it stands a person in a gray suit, their face indistinguishable. They speak clearly and slowly, stating that silence is a form of observation and the absence of noise does not mean the absence of sound. Next, they list numbers and dates, one of which coincides with the day of an accident at a nearby substation. Subsequent dates pointed towards the future. At the moment the word choice is uttered, the camera jerks and the image distorts. The final phrase on the recording is, "If you hear this, you are already inside. The lecture has begun." The archivist, after viewing the recording, soon ended up in a psychiatric hospital. His diary was later given to his family. It contained the same words written dozens of times. Zero is not a beginning. It is an entrance. The film reel was disposed of. However, there is a rumor that a copy surfaces online. It lasts exactly 9 minutes, and at the end, a voice asks, "Is your silence ready?" Fact 49th. In a mining settlement near Kemerovo in 1971, a series of complaints about crying from underground was recorded. Initially, residents thought it was the sound of ventilation units. But one old miner, Uncle Nikolai, said he had heard similar sounds back in the 1940s, before the collapse of the drift where his shift perished. The hum, turning into a moan, lasted for several minutes and then subsided. At that time, no one was informed, and now the sound has returned. A young geologist who had just arrived at the site suggested recording the noise. They lowered a microphone into an old, disused mine shaft. The recording captured a low, rhythmic hum resembling distant footsteps. And at the 44th second, a voice says, "I am waiting for you to open the door. You are already digging." A week later, mine shaft number 7 collapsed. 2 workers died. The geologist was transferred to another region. Before leaving, he left a cassette with the recording in the watch house. On its cover, it was written in charcoal, "Do not turn on near the ground. He hears himself." Fact 50. In the late 1990s, in a communal apartment in St. Petersburg, which was converted from a merchant's mansion, strange occurrences began to happen. In one of the rooms, an old, disconnected telephone with no wires or socket started ringing with remarkable regularity. The phone was used solely as a retro decoration. Every day, precisely at 5:18 a.m., it would begin to ring, starting softly and then growing louder. The residents attempted to remove the phone, but the next day it would invariably be back in its place. On one occasion, they decided to record the ringing on video. The recording captured initial clicks followed by a short voice. "I'm still on the stairs. Open up." They then called a technician. Upon opening the phone's casing, it was found to be empty inside. No coil, no speaker. The only item found was a note folded into thirds which read, "You didn't hear him, but now you have." A month later, the downstairs neighbors moved out, complaining of hearing footsteps at night on a staircase that led nowhere. The house was later sold and the furniture was removed. However, during an inspection of the basement, an old telephone line was discovered, with one wire going directly into a brick wall. Its destination could not be determined. Notably, the wall in that spot remained warmer even in winter. Fact 51st. In Kazan, in 1985, a programmer was working on a system for automatically generating train schedules. For testing purposes, he entered random time intervals into the program and noticed that the system provided exact matches with real railway accidents that had occurred in recent years. He decided to repeat the experiment and obtained new dates. 2 weeks later, an accident happened on the section that the program had predicted. The time code in the system was marked in red, and next to it was a comment that the programmer had not entered. Сбой подтвержден. Повтор разрешен. He disabled the system, but each time it was launched, it self-restored and displayed only one screen, a black background with white letters stating "Вы в маршруте," you are on the route. The last time he tried to delete the program, his own name appeared on the screen along with a date. The next day, he left the city and disappeared. The hard drive with the system was placed in an archive. However, several years later, it turned on by itself without power or access. The monitor displayed only one phrase: «Следующий остановится там, где не ждет». The next one will stop where it is not expected. Fact 52nd. In an old house in Krasnoyarsk, formerly owned by a theater artist, workers discovered drawings behind the wallpaper during wall demolition. All were graphite, as if scratched with a nail: rooms, staircases, doors. Each depicted a figure with an inverted face. Nearby were inscriptions: "He waits behind the curtains. Don't stand on the fifth landing. If he turns around, wake up." The walls were photographed, but the films were exposed. One of the builders took a fragment of plaster molding with one of the phrases: "Whispers when you are almost asleep." That same evening, he was found unconscious in the building's entrance. He survived but lost his speech. Later, he could only write one word: returned. The house was demolished. However, locals say that at night on the foundation site, it sounds like someone is walking up a non-existent staircase. If you stand in this spot a bit longer, it might seem that the air becomes denser, and someone is standing behind you, silently, close, without touching, and waiting for you to look back. Fact 53rd. In Tver, in 1990, a woman named Galina rented an apartment in a pre-war building. Everything was normal until she started hearing a strange click every night at 2:04 a.m. At first, she thought it was mice, then a meter. But the sound came from the wall next to her bed. A couple of weeks later, she woke up to the click sounding right next to her ear. A crack appeared on the wall. It grew wider each day. One day, Galina leaned her ear against it and heard a knock. It sounded as if someone from the other side was knocking back, perfectly in sync. In a panic, she moved out. A year later, her neighbor complained that she also started getting a crack in the same spot. She heard a voice at night: "I'm almost there. Don't interfere." The wall was opened. There was no cavity. Only old brickwork and a paper roll stuffed into a gap. Inside was a piece of newspaper from 1938 and the inscription, "He's still banging. Don't open." The newspaper was sent to the archive, and the crack started again, this time on the third floor. Fact 54th. In Sevastopol, in 1977, a group of schoolchildren walking along the shore stumbled upon a cave that no one had noticed before. The entrance was narrow and dark. One of the boys decided to go inside with a flashlight. The others waited. 15 minutes passed, then 20. They screamed. Their friend returned from the darkness, in the same clothes, but silent. He did not answer any questions. He just looked. It was later discovered that he did not have the scar on his cheek that the real boy had. Also, his shoes were a different size. The real child was found in the cave only 2 days later. He was panicked and claimed that he constantly heard someone breathing behind him, imitating his voice and repeating his every step. The pseudo-boy disappeared. Later, the parents recalled that their son's reflection in the mirror showed a silhouette slightly taller and somewhat blurry, as if the glass remembered someone else. The cave was blocked with stones. However, local children are still afraid to go there, because if you stand at the entrance, you can hear someone copying your breathing, with a delay, half a step behind. Fact 55th. In 2001 year, in Yekaterinburg, a girl named Alyona bought an antique alarm clock at a flea market. It was not working, but she liked its appearance and placed it on a shelf in her bedroom. After a few nights, it started ticking. Alyona thought perhaps the spring had engaged and wound it. It wound up, it would wind itself every evening, even when she was not home. And at 3:07 every night, the hands would begin to move backward. She tried to get rid of the alarm clock, throwing it into a trash bin. In the morning, it was back in its original place. Then she put it on the staircase. The next morning, she found it at her doorstep, ticking. It was no longer showing the time, but simply spinning its hands in a circle. A few days later, she heard the alarm clock in the silence striking not minutes but footsteps, one after another. It sounded as if someone was walking into her apartment, slowly, clockwise. On the day the hand stopped, she was no more. Neighbors claimed that on that night, all the electronic clocks on their floor froze at 3:07 and never moved again. Fact 56th. In 1982, surveyors discovered an old signpost in a forest near Tomsk. It was a metal pole, rusty, with a single inscription, "You have passed." There were no other markings, such as arrows or a map. Locals claimed it hadn't been there before. One of the engineers decided to follow the presumed direction, using moss and a compass for guidance. After 40 minutes, he returned, pale, silent, with scratches on his neck. He later stated, "There shouldn't be a staircase in the forest, but there was." He described a stone staircase leading down, without railings, disappearing into blackness. No one else saw it. A week later, he resigned. An attempt was made to dig up the pole, but it was unsuccessful. The metal extended several meters into the ground, and even an oxyacetylene torch couldn't cut through it. When local workers were called, they refused to approach. One said, "It shows those who are ready." 2 years later, the signpost vanished. All that remained was a circular, scorched area in the grass, like an imprint from something heavy, or perhaps a footprint. Fact 57th. In an old hotel in Ulyanovsk, which was closed for renovation in 1995, in room number 311, workers found a gap in the floor during repairs. Beneath the linoleum was a manhole cover that was not on the plans. Below it was a square room with concrete walls and a single item, a wooden chair. On the wall above it, words were scratched with fingernails. "Sit until he passes. If you stand, he will reach you." The concrete surface around the chair was polished smooth, as if someone had walked in circles hundreds of times. When an engineer descended with a camera, the flash did not work the first time. On the second shot, a translucent silhouette appeared in the right corner. After this picture, the engineer began having fits. He complained of feeling footsteps behind him, even when standing still. A month later, he disappeared. The manhole was filled with cement, and the room was sealed off. However, security guards claimed that on certain nights, a scratching sound could be heard from under the floor. It always happened at 3:11, as if someone were climbing but not rushing. Fact 58th. In Cherepovets in 1989, a pensioner named T complained that at night her clothes in the closet were changing places. A dress would hang in a different spot, a coat would be fastened differently, and once a shirt appeared that she had never worn. Her family decided it was due to her age. But her granddaughter, who was staying overnight with her grandmother, heard someone opening the closet doors at night. Silently, without a creak, just a click, and then darkness. She got up and looked inside. Inside, there was only clothing, but one of the hangers was slowly swaying, as if someone had just let go of it. That same night, the grandmother said, "He takes my clothes to try on if the skin fits." The next day, the woman did not wake up. After her death, the closet was dismantled. In the wall, they found a cutout on that side, as if someone could have gotten from the inside into the niche between the apartments. But there were no passages from either side. The wall was solid. Only in the plywood was something cut out resembling a handprint. Not an adult's and not a child's. The closet was burned, or so they thought, because 2 years later it was allegedly seen at a landfill, standing separately, and with its door ajar. Fact 59th. In 1992, in Volgograd, a display board was found in the attic of an old school, hidden behind a wooden panel. It featured student photographs, handwritten captions, and a plaque reading "Distinguished in Observation." All the pictures were black and white and blurry, as if taken from under a desk. Some showed children with closed eyes, while others depicted figures in the shadows next to the school children. None of the teachers could recall these children. The archives did not match. One of the deputy principals recognized his surname in a caption, though he had no such photograph. An attempt was made to examine the negatives, but they were not found. Later, a 10th grade student reported that the walls in the old biology classroom whisper at night. He recorded it on a dictaphone. The recording begins with normal background noise, and then a voice is heard saying, "They are still distinguished, and now they are watching you." The boy soon left the city. The display board was dismantled and the photographs were burned. But one day, a list was printed in the teacher's lounge, titled Distinguished in 2022. It contained 7 names. 5 of them died under strange circumstances. The rest are unreachable. Fact 60. In 1986, a rare documentary film about Siberian weavers was shown at an old cinema in Rostov-on-Don. The screening was empty, with only one person in the hall, the watchman. After it ended, he stated that he had seen a different film. According to him, it wasn't about workers, but about an empty house where doors opened by themselves and someone whispered from a pipe, "He is near, don't turn around." The cassette used in the projector turned out to be genuine, with no signs of editing. However, the watchman insisted that the screen showed something else. After that night, he began sleeping during the day, afraid to fall asleep in the dark. A month later, he disappeared. In 1997, the cinema was demolished. In the underground parking lot built in its place, surveillance cameras record a 15-second glitch once a year. At this moment, a short frame appears on the screens. A white corridor, a staircase leading down, and a silhouette standing by a turned-off screen. This happens every year at midnight on December 13th. No one knows why, but the system only restarts manually, as if someone presses pause. Fact 61. In 1970, in a settlement near the Kurchatov Institute, children found an abandoned shed with an inscription on the door, "While he sleeps." Inside, there was only dust, cobwebs, and a strange metal structure resembling a chair. On the floor was a frozen puddle of water, even though it was July. One of the boys, Vova, sat in the chair as a joke. After a couple of minutes, he said, "Do you hear?" He finally woke up. The others ran away. The next day, Vova disappeared. His belongings remained, and the shed door was locked. 10 years later, another boy living in the same settlement began to speak in fragmented phrases. He sat in the chair, said the stairs lead the wrong way, don't sleep when it's cold from below. No one taught him these words. And in 2001, during another inspection of the shed's remains, one of the researchers found a date scratched on the wall, 2026. And nearby, "He will come out if we forget." The shed was burned, but even on the ashes, the thermometer showed a temperature 5 degrees lower than the surrounding area, as if the cold still remembered where it came from. Fact 62. In Nizhny Tagil, in the year 1991, a woman named Maria complained to the housing management office that a second reflection had appeared behind the mirror in her bathroom. This reflection moved slightly slower than she did, sometimes stopped and watched. Her neighbors laughed. This changed when the house began experiencing power outages. All devices with screens at night showed the same symbols, 3 black stripes on a white background with the inscription, "It is watching." Maria stopped leaving her home. She was last seen in the morning, standing motionless in front of the mirror. A day later, she was gone. The door was locked from the inside. On the mirror was a palm print, imprinted from the back. When the glass was removed, a message was found on the wall behind it. "I was the first, but now there are 2 of us." The house stood until the mid-2000s, after which it burned down. The cause of the fire was not determined. However, a firefighter on duty that shift later recounted that as they climbed the stairs, one of the mirror shards on the floor reflected them with an extra person. The 6th was where there should have been air. Fact 63. In a settlement near Ust-Kut in 1984, divers inspected an old bridge that had gone underwater after a flood. One of them noticed a niche under a support, as if carved by hand. Swimming inside, he found an old road sign, turn in 200 meters, and a perfectly preserved ceramic doll. He took the doll to the surface. That same night, the diver began having hallucinations. He heard someone knocking on his house windows. Shadows crawled on the walls, and an inscription appeared on the mirror: "You turned the wrong way." His colleagues attributed it all to oxygen deprivation. But 3 days later, the doll disappeared. A surveillance camera showed it simply ceasing to be in place frame by frame. The diver stopped communicating. His apartment was opened. On the floor were wet footprints of bare feet leading to an open window. Only a phrase scratched with a fingernail remained on the windowsill: "He came for the one who broke the sign." Fact 64th. In 1973 in Smolensk, during the repair of a building that formerly housed an archive, a hatch was found in the ceiling. This hatch led to a narrow space between floors, inaccessible by any stairs. Inside, there was a wooden box and a bundle of papers. The papers were lists containing surnames, birth dates, and death dates. The issue was that for some individuals, these death dates had not yet occurred. One of the construction workers recognized his surname and the date in 2 days. He laughed it off and took a photo of the sheet. That same evening, he was hit by a truck and died. The papers were burned. However, one of the sheets survived. Since then, every few years, someone in the city receives an anonymous letter with a printout of that very page. At the end, there was a note: "If you are reading this, your time has already begun. It's too late to run. Just stay silent." There is no official confirmation, but the city's printing house has, on several occasions, received orders for nameplates that later appeared on gravestones before they were even registered at the morgue. Fact 65th. In 1996, at an industrial plant in Tula, a machine operator decided to check the maintenance log. According to him, incomprehensible entries began appearing in the columns between shifts, written in pencil. He watched, he touched the metal. Initially, it was dismissed as a prank. However, later, handprints, as if burned onto the surface, were found on parts processed during the night. One worker stated that he saw a shadow with longer than usual arms lean over the machine. He was fired for drunkenness. A month later, his shift mate disappeared, vanishing during the night shift. The machine continued to operate, and only a dry drop of black lubricant remained on the chair. A couple of days later, the log contained a new entry: "He left. Now you." The log burned down in a fire in the utility room. No one knows how the steel ignited. And the machine on that line still suddenly turns on by itself, despite the power being disconnected. The cameras at these moments show a black screen. Always. Fact 66th. In 1981, in Irkutsk, a schoolgirl named Lyuda started keeping a diary of her dreams. According to her, every night she found herself in the same corridor, long, wooden, with doors on both sides. Initially, the corridor was empty, but then a silhouette appeared at one of the doors. It did not move, but with each dream it got closer. Lyuda recorded everything: the color of the walls, the number of steps to the door, the smell. "It smells like old water." The last entry read, "He is standing at my door. Today I will try not to sleep." In the morning, the girl did not wake up. Doctors found no cause. Everything was normal. But her younger brother said that at night he heard Lyuda say in her sleep, "He is beyond the threshold. If it opens, go, but don't look at his face." After her death, the diary disappeared. However, her literature teacher, while checking notebooks, found a page with someone else's handwriting. On it was a plan of the corridor and the signature: Number 12. It opened. The following week, another student fell ill. She began to draw the same corridors and the same door. Fact 67th. In 1998 in Kharkiv, an amateur photographer found a box of developed but unprinted negatives in a photo lab. The pictures were ordinary: streets, entrances, people's faces. But in a number of shots, the same figure repeated in the corner of the frame. A person in black clothing, always standing at a distance, always in shadow. out of focus. He was not part of the scene, and no one reacted to him. The author of the shots was not listed. The film was anonymous. The photographer began to study the frames, enlarged one of them, and noticed that the figure became clearer in each subsequent shot. In the last one, he was standing right up to the lens. 2 days later, the photographer disappeared. His colleagues claimed he started behaving strangely. He asked not to look into the viewfinder, took pictures blindly, taped over the mirrors. Surveillance cameras last recorded him standing by the wall of the darkroom, looking into a corner. And something was moving there. When the last film was developed, it contained only one photograph, his own back, and someone's hand resting on his shoulder. Fact 68. In 1975, in the Moscow region, school children on an excursion to the house museum of an old writer saw a typewriter. According to the guide, the writer's last words were typed on it. A boy named Vitya asked if he could try. He approached, pressed a key, and instead of a letter, the phrase appeared on the ribbon. "He is still here. Don't turn around." Vitya was led away, but since then he began to stutter. A week later, his mother discovered repeating lines in his notebooks. "He looks through the letters. Don't type A." When the notebooks were checked, it turned out that on each page the letter A was slightly distorted, as if struck harder than the others. Soon, the boy disappeared. The typewriter was removed from the exhibition, but at night, the night watchman heard something clanking in the hall. The table where the typewriter stood began to crack in the center, as if something heavy was pressing from the inside. A year later, the museum closed. The inspection report contains a strange entry. The sound of typing is heard even when there is no paper. No one saw where that typewriter went. Only once in another city it was recognized by a dent on its lid. It stood in an attic covered in dust and fingerprints. Fact 69th. In 1986, in Norilsk, a geological party reported an anomaly. Compasses in the area of one of the passes began to tremble. The needle did not rotate but vibrated slightly, as if reacting to a presence. One of the employees, named Sokolov, suggested staying overnight. He set up a tent and began keeping a diary. The last entry read, "He is walking in a circle, 5 steps left, 3 steps back, not breathing." In the morning, the tent was found empty. However, around it on the ground was a perfectly round path trodden by bare feet. In the middle was a left-behind cassette with a recording. On it, there was heavy breathing, silence, and a single whisper. "If you are listening to this, he is near." A month later, another geologist, unaware of the first incident, entered the same zone and described similar sensations in his report. He was rescued, but he kept repeating the same thing. "I heard him counting. He walks by numbers. He has almost finished counting." The pass was excluded from routes. To this day, no one calls it by its name, only as the place where clocks don't move. Fact 70. In the Samara region, in 1993, teenagers were playing near an abandoned water tower building. One of them found an old door leading to the basement and decided to go down. Inside, there was a damp concrete floor and metal pipes, nothing unusual. Only on the wall, written in red paint, "If you heard the name, it's already too late." That same evening, the boy reported hearing a voice whispering his name from the depths. Afterward, the voice began to repeat his actions. It was copying me, but slowly, as if it was lagging. 3 days later, the boy disappeared. His friends went back to that place. Under the basement door, there were bare footprints. One of the girls, standing at the entrance, heard her name spoken barely audibly, not by the boy, but by someone with a rasp, as if through rusty pipes. The building was soon demolished, and when they tried to build a store in its place, the excavator broke down 3 times, and a hum rose from the excavation pit, as if someone was breathing deeply underground. The boy's name is no longer spoken, but he is still being called, sometimes in a whisper. Fact 71. In 1988, in a small mining town near Kiselevsk, an unlabeled videotape was found in the local library. The librarian, deciding to check the contents, played the tape. First, an empty screen, then an image of a dimly lit room. In the center was an empty chair. A whisper could be heard off camera, discernible only when the volume was increased. "He sits when you turn it off." 15 minutes later, the chair in the frame had shifted slightly, then began to slowly turn. The camera remained stationary. The final frame briefly showed a face, unrecognizable, blurred, as if behind glass. After watching, the librarian stopped speaking. Doctors diagnosed reactive mute hysteria. A note was later found on his apartment wall. "He sits in the corner where the light doesn't reach." The tape disappeared. However, years later, a copy allegedly surfaced in a private collection. Those who tried to watch it to the end reported that the room grew colder, and the chair nearby turned on its own. Fact 72nd. In 1990, at the warehouse of an old furniture factory in Perm, workers discovered a wardrobe that was not listed in any inventory. Its doors were sealed with wax. Inside, the wardrobe was empty, except for a paper tag attached to a nail, bearing the inscription, "He who opens it must look first." One of the security guards, who decided to take the wardrobe home, soon began complaining that at night he heard rustling sounds from inside, as if someone was walking on wood. This was followed by a quiet voice calling his name. Neighbors confirmed that at night the sound of doors opening could be heard in his apartment, but in the morning everything remained in place. A week later, the guard disappeared. Only the wardrobe was found in his apartment, now with a mirror on the inner wall. The reflection showed a bed, a corner of the room, and a dark funnel behind the viewer. The wardrobe was taken back to the warehouse. However, the watchman on duty that night claims he saw the doors open by themselves, and in the depth, a silhouette flashed for a second. Since then, no tenant has agreed to rent the building, and the wardrobe still stands in the corner. No one approaches it. Fact 73rd. In 1971, in Yaroslav, teenagers found a map on the wall of an apartment building's basement. It was drawn in chalk and depicted corridors, arrows, and labels such as "Go Around," "Don't Step," and "Time is Here." At the center was a circle with the inscription, "The point where he repeats." Initially, they thought it was a prank. However, one resident, examining the map, noted that it mirrored the actual layout of the building's basements, including those sealed during construction. He went to verify. Half an hour later, he returned in silence. He then began removing all the clocks in his apartment, saying, if he sees the time, he will choose someone. 2 days later, he disappeared. In the basement, a new inscription appeared, seemingly chalk but pressed into the brick. "You have started the count again." The building stood until the early 2000s. Attempts to demolish it failed. Equipment broke down, and workers refused to enter the basement. It later emerged that every 7 years, someone disappeared there. It always happened in October on the same day. On one section of the wall, which had never been painted, a circle clearly showed through. It is still there. Fact 74th. In 1964, in Moscow, on the attic of an old apartment building being demolished, a wooden plaque was found. It had a burned-in phrase, "He stood here when everyone was asleep." Beneath it was a polished spot on the floor, as if someone had stood in one place for hours. Nearby was a sealed tin box. It was opened. Inside were pocket watches running backward and a newspaper clipping with a cutout article. The headline was partially visible, "Series Disappeared," on Patri. No archives confirmed the existence of such an issue. The watches stopped when they were removed from the box. On the same day, 3 workers experienced panic attacks. One claimed to have seen someone standing on the wrong side in the mirror. Another that a shadow moved separately from a person. Construction was halted. A month later, the building was still demolished, but 3 workers from the crew subsequently vanished without a trace. In the new high-rise built on this site, residents' electronic clocks regularly malfunction. This occurs only in apartments with a northwest view, where that plaque once was. Fact 75th. In Voronezh in 1995, a schoolboy brought a strange piece of paper to a history lesson. He claimed he found it in an old textbook left at the library. The paper looked like a newspaper fragment but had a future date, April 12, 2024. The text described events that had not yet happened: a fire in a shopping mall, a bridge collapse, and a series of power outages. Everything was written in the past tense. Teachers dismissed it as a prank. The paper was taken. But 10 years later, on April 12, 2005, a fire did occur, followed by other events that matched in detail. Attempts were made to find the paper, but it disappeared. The schoolboy himself later said the paper appeared on its own, between pages where there was nothing before. In the old library, on the same shelf, another fragment was found, this time with a different date. It contained only one line: "Do not read aloud. He hears and prepares." This paper also vanished. However, a duty log still exists in the archive, which on April 12th had a note: "The paper returned." Fact 76. In a village near Saransk, in 1982, a rural mathematics teacher took a walk every evening along the same path behind the school. After a year, he began to notice that at a certain point on his route, the shadow of his body split into two. One was the usual one, and the other lagged slightly and moved at a different angle. He photographed this. The picture clearly shows two silhouettes. One stood with its hands at its sides, while the other had a hand that seemed to reach out to the first. The teacher stopped his walks, but the shadow appeared in his house, on the kitchen wall, regardless of the lighting. He wrote in his diary, "The second shadow stood next to me. It remembers where I look." A week later, neighbors heard a loud sound, as if something had collapsed in the house. The teacher was gone. Soot remained on the kitchen wall, shaped like two people standing side by side. The house burned down under strange circumstances. One of the firefighters said that before the flash, he saw a silhouette in the kitchen window. It did not move. It only watched. Fact 77. In 1977, in Omsk, employees of a communications enterprise conducted a technical inspection. During this inspection, they discovered an old, disconnected telephone set that was still emitting a signal. The device was unplugged, but the next day it rang again. They decided to pick up the receiver, but only silence answered. After 20 seconds, a whispered phrase was heard: "Thank you. Now I know where you are." The apparatus was discarded, but it reappeared in a utility room. A piece of paper attached to it, bearing a fresh date and signature, was found. Neither the ink nor the paper matched the era. Specialists concluded that someone was playing a prank. However, the situation escalated when one of the technicians disappeared. His last call was recorded from a number that no longer existed on the network. When the telephone was completely dismantled, a note was found inside: "While you wait for the dial tone, it's already coming." Following this, the building was repurposed. In the new organization occupying the same location, telephone malfunctions occur regularly. Furthermore, once a month, an incoming call appears in the call log. It has no number. The accompanying signature reads, "Answer received." Fact 78. In 1966, in Astrakhan, a drawing teacher at a school allowed a student to use an old protractor found in the supply room. The next day, the boy began complaining that the lines on his paper were drifting sideways on their own. He drew accurately, but the results were distorted. Once, while constructing a 90-degree angle, he created a figure resembling a spiral. That same evening, what he had drawn appeared in chalk on the classroom wall, even though the boy claimed he hadn't transferred anything. A week later, he stopped speaking. On the pages of his notebook, a phrase was found repeated hundreds of times: "He returns on an arc. We drew his path." The protractor disappeared. The classroom began experiencing malfunctions. Furniture creaked at night, and the corners of drawings started to twist by themselves. When a geometer was called to inspect the building's foundation, he stated, "The area doesn't match. There should be less space here than there is." The classroom was sealed off. However, the walls sometimes remain damp, as if someone is drawing on them from the inside, only with a compass. Fact 79th. In Kaliningrad, in 2003, an archivist named Gleb was digitizing a collection of letters from World War II. Among them was a strange letter without a date or signature, written in neat, almost official handwriting. It stated, "I survived because I listened to him walking. He always steps on the fifth board, then falls silent." There was no information about the letter's origin. The paper was modern. The handwriting did not match any wartime templates. A day later, Gleb brought the letter home. The following evening, neighbors heard him pacing the floor, measuring steps rhythmically and repeatedly. An hour later, silence fell. Relatives who were called found him barefoot, sitting in the kitchen corner. He didn't speak, only moved his fingers as if counting. A worn path was discovered on the floor. 5 steps, pause, turn, repeat. The walls were intact, but in one corner, under the wallpaper, another sheet of paper was found. It was blank, except for a short note at the bottom. "Now you are the fifth." Fact 80. In 1994, in a Moscow region village abandoned since the 60s, local historians found a semi-ruined house. On its door was a charcoal inscription, "Sound lives here." Inside, there was dust, furniture debris, and an old frame without glass. However, in the center of the room stood a perfectly clean gramophone. There were no wires or signs of recent tampering. They decided to turn it on. It started. There was no needle, but a scraping sound emerged, followed by a female voice. "You are late. He is already inside." One of the tourists screamed and ran out. The others were stunned into silence. 3 days later, they returned to the house. Neither the gramophone nor the inscription was there. But someone had written in the dust on the wall with a finger, "Do not listen a second time." Later, one of the tourists began to hear a scraping sound at night, a noise that seemed to come not from outside, but as if from inside his ears. The hospital found nothing. He recorded this noise himself on a dictaphone. When played back, a second voice message appeared on the tape. "He now hears what you hear." The tape disappeared during its transfer to the archive, as did everyone who had listened to it. Fact 81. In 1970, in Vitebsk, in a dormitory room where a new resident had recently moved in, the floor monitor found a mirror that was not listed in the inventory. It stood in the corner, leaning against the wall. When the new resident, a student named Yuri, tried to move it, the glass trembled, and he said that for a moment he saw his reflection from behind. In those days, he began to notice that the shadow in the mirror was out of step, and the lag was increasing. On the 4th night, he left a note, "If I don't enter the reflection, he will enter me." In the morning, the door was locked. Yuri was not found. There was a crack in the mirror. At the bottom were fingerprints, as if someone had tried to climb out from the inside. The mirror was moved to the basement. A few years later, it was accidentally given for disposal, but a glazier refused to work with it, saying, "It hums, not in the ear, but in the bone." Now, no one knows where it is. But one day, in a similar room in another dormitory, a student complained that his reflection had started standing closer than he was himself, and it looked slightly downwards. Fact 82nd. In Kazan, in 1999, a taxi driver was giving a ride to a silent passenger at night. The man got into the back seat, stayed at his destination, and remained motionless throughout the journey. When the car arrived, he got out, leaving a cassette on the seat, labeled, "Do not repeat the route." The driver listened to it at home. The recording featured the sound of tires, his own voice, and a second voice he didn't remember. It dictated turns, named streets, and told him where to look. It concluded with the phrase, "Now you are driving. He will be nearby." That same night, the taxi driver disappeared. His car was found on the roadside with the engine running, doors open, and no one inside. On the dashboard was the same cassette, rewound to the end. Since then, rumors have circulated in the city. If you drive the same route for several consecutive days at night, you might meet the passenger without a route. He gets in, stays silent, but cannot be seen in the rearview mirror. And if you suddenly hear a voice guiding your way, do not listen, because at that moment you are no longer driving to your own destination. Fact 83rd. In 1983 in Vologda, at the warehouse of a book printing house, a box was found containing children's books that were not listed on any delivery note. The book's cover depicted a cartoon forest, and the title was "Look Deeper," with no author credited. The text inside was peculiar. Sentences began like a typical fairy tale, but ended with strange phrases such as, "And then the bunny closed its eyes because he was below," or "The fox walked along the path where snow did not fall because they still remembered there." The illustrations were distorted. Characters had misplaced eyes, and trees had human hands. One of the printing house workers gave the book to his daughter. 2 days later, the girl said that the bunny comes at night, but without eyes, and whispers from under the floor. That same night, the parents found a page under their daughter's bed, written in small handwriting. On top of it was a dirty paw print. The book was burned. But the next day, a new copy appeared in the family's mailbox. There was no return address. Inside, there was only the inscription, "Now you have read, now he knows." Fact 84th. In Murmansk, in 1990, water was shut off in a student dormitory for 3 days. One of the students, Sasha, went down to the basement to check the pipes. He did not return. When the watchman went there, he found a note on the door of the utility room. "Listen before it gets dark." Inside, there were dry pipes, but on the floor was a puddle of water that did not evaporate. It was warm. From the center of this puddle, sounds were heard as if someone was breathing, slowly and heavily. An hour later, the watchman also disappeared. When rescuers inspected the basement, a flashlight fell into the puddle, and the light from it seemed to be absorbed, not reflecting. After a day, the water disappeared. Only a wet footprint of bare feet remained on the floor. Since then, in that building, dripping sounds are sometimes heard in the shower, even with the taps closed. And in the bathroom mirror, a steamy phrase appears. "You heard him. He now knows what you sound like." Those who read it aloud are later heard walking at night, even if they have left. Fact 85th. In 1972, geologists on the Kola Peninsula described an anomalous zone where radio signals disappeared and clock hands lagged by 15 minutes. At the center of this zone was a peculiar stone, perfectly smooth, devoid of lichen, as if recently worked. One engineer attempted to place a marking on it. After 10 minutes, he began experiencing hallucinations, claiming he heard someone trying out voices, each time closer. He was sent to the medical station but vanished during the night. The stone later started to feel warm to the touch, regardless of the weather. Photographs taken near it failed to develop. In their reports, geologists noted that at night, utterances in a familiar voice but with a different intonation were heard from the zone's center. When the area was slated for demolition to prevent accidents, a crater remained at the epicenter. The soil within turned black and resisted analysis. However, once a year, steam rises from it, and a voice matching that engineer's is heard on cameras, saying, "I didn't immediately realize I had become an echo." Fact 86th. In Kurgan in 1988, at the Solnishko kindergarten, educators began to notice that children in the Ramashka group were playing a peculiar game. They would sit in a circle and call out names. Then they would freeze. The teachers initially thought it was just a childish invention until one day a boy named Grisha named another child and that child fainted. The children explained, "That's how he chose him. Now Grisha is next." A week later, Grisha disappeared. On his bed, there was a piece of paper with crooked lines. He became the last, but not the final one. The voice is already in the circle. The teacher recalled hearing this phrase in her childhood, in a different kindergarten, in a different city. Archives revealed that in the late 70s, a child also disappeared from that kindergarten. His last game was the same, a circle and names. and each time a new person would be the leader. After the incident, the group was disbanded. Later, another child from a neighboring district drew a diagram of the game, a circle, arrows, and someone's eyes in the center. Beneath the drawing were the words, "You called, now you don't choose." Fact 87th. In 1992, on the outskirts of Arkhangelsk, a man found a box of tapes in an old barn. All of them were labeled with one word: silence. When the first tape was played, only background noise, like wind, was heard. But after 5 minutes, quiet breathing could be heard. Then a voice said, "If you hear this, it means he is closer." They decided not to play the other tapes. The man told his neighbor about it, who nevertheless decided to listen to the second tape. On it, the voice repeatedly spoke the man's name, growing louder and clearer with each minute. That same night, the lights went out in the house where they were listening to the recording. Both of them disappeared. Only one tape was found, paused. A new inscription appeared on its label. "The next one who plays it will let him in." The police confiscated the tapes, but for some reason, they were found arranged in a different order in the evidence storage. The employee responsible for their storage quit 2 days later, leaving the following phrase in his personal file: "Silence is not the absence of sound, it is him breathing." Fact 88th. In a nursing home in Kaluga in 1979, one of the residents, a former engineer named Nikolai, claimed that every night he heard someone counting. It started quietly, then grew louder. He tried to write down the numbers he heard, but his lists always ended at 99. On the night he heard the 100th count, the entire wing of the home woke up to his scream. Nikolai sat on his bed, pointing to a corner and whispering, "He finished counting. Now it's my turn." He was transferred to the psychiatric ward, where he fell silent forever. On his table, a sheet of paper was found with only one number: 100. Beneath it was a strange note, as if written in someone else's handwriting. Next, he counts backward. A week later, another resident began behaving similarly. Doctors attempted to erase the writings, but at night, numbers appeared on the walls of the ward, counting down from 100. One of the orderlies later confessed that he woke up in the post room to the sound of breathing and a clear voice saying, 41, 40, 40. He quit his job. Since then, ward number 100 has been repurposed as a storage room. Fact 89th. In Krasnoyarsk, in the year 1985, a schoolgirl named Anya drew a peculiar pattern during a labor class, a circle with 4 dots and curved lines inside. When her teacher asked what it was, the girl replied, "That's what the door looks like when he knocks." Initially, this was considered a fantasy. However, that same night, the girl's mother heard a scratching sound in the hallway, as if claws were scraping the floor. The door was locked. The next morning, the same drawing was found in the apartment, scratched onto the inside of the doorframe. Anya began writing in reverse, speaking in whispers even when not addressed. Her diary contained an entry: "He only enters where he is drawn." A week later, the family disappeared. The apartment showed signs as if something had crawled on the ceiling. A circle drawn in chalk was left on the wall. The building was later evacuated. Yet, children from the neighboring yard recount that if you approach that entrance at night, you can hear something scratching on wood. Light emanates from a closed window, and a barely discernible whisper: "Be careful not to draw it again." Fact 90. In Nizhny Novgorod, in the year 2001, a suitcase with film was found in the attic of an old house. The label read, "Do not watch alone." The recording lasted 20 minutes. The footage shows a man sitting in an empty room. The camera was set up statically. The first 15 minutes were silent. Then the man begins to turn around, as if hearing footsteps, but no one is there. At the end, he stands up, walks to the lens, and says, "Now you are watching. Now I see you." The person who found the film was a video editor at a local television station. He watched the recording at home, alone. He did not come to work the next morning. His apartment was found empty, but on the screen of his television, which was left on, the last frame repeated: the room, the camera, an empty chair. Behind it, a barely visible silhouette. Later, attempts were made to copy the film, but the equipment burned out. One technician managed to take a freeze frame. It showed a window reflecting the camera and the person holding it, but the editor was alone. Fact 91. In 1981 in Saratov, during the demolition of an old wooden house, workers found a room without windows, boarded up from the inside. Inside, there was an old mattress, a couple of books, and a notebook. The entries in the notebook were strange. "He doesn't breathe unless I blink. The clock whispers when there's little time left. If I close the door, he will appear in the mirror." The last entry was smudged, as if written in haste. "He sat down. He became me. I am behind the door." The builders laughed, but one of them decided to keep the books. 3 days later, his wife reported that he had started behaving strangely. He spoke with a distorted intonation, confused tenses, and at night sat in an armchair staring at a turned-off television. On the 4th night, she woke up and saw him standing in the doorway. And in the armchair sat a man exactly like him. The second man was gone when the light was turned on. A day later, the worker disappeared. And in his house, under the wallpaper, a phrase was found: "He returns through those who took what wasn't theirs." Fact 92nd. In Petrozavodsk, in the year 1997, a local newspaper journalist was investigating a series of strange calls received by residents of a specific block. All described the same thing: silence on the line, then a whisper of their name, followed by strange words that seemed composed of old Russian roots and Latin endings. One resident recorded a conversation. When the journalist listened to the tape, he began to hear these words outside the recording, in silence, in the rustling of pages, in the elevator. He wrote in his notebook, "Words do not live in language, they walk." A week later, his colleagues found him in the newsroom. He was sitting with his back to the entrance, repeating "non videbit," which in Latin means "will not see." His eyes were closed. He never opened them again. The tape was sent for analysis, but specialists could not determine the sound source, as the frequencies were outside the normal range. One linguist, after listening to the recording, began speaking a fictional language a month later. Only one word was familiar: the journalist's name. Fact 93rd. In 1963, in Alma-Ata, a photojournalist captured a street scene on black and white film. During development, one frame revealed a figure in the middle of a crowd that had not been present at the time of shooting. This figure faced the camera, but its face was indistinct, as if blurred. The film was undamaged. The photographer decided to develop the remaining frames, and on each, the figure was getting closer. On the 4th picture, it was a few meters away. On the 5th, it was almost touching the lens. The 6th frame was black. The camera was functioning correctly. A day later, the photographer began complaining of a feeling that someone was standing behind him. Mirrors in the room started to fog over. In the dark, he saw a reflection, like from a lens. After a week, this sensation disappeared. The laboratory found only the camera and a negative that hadn't existed before. A frame seemingly taken from the same spot, but now without people. Only the street remained, and someone's shadow behind the lens. Fact 94th. In 1978, at a children's camp near Penza, pioneers played a nighttime game in a house of horrors, a typical prank involving sheets and a basement. The last to enter was a boy named Dima. When the others tried to scare him, he didn't react, just stared into space. Then he said, "He's not playing. He lives here. I saw him before you." The boy stopped talking. He was taken home, but soon disappeared. A year later, in the camp's basement, where the scare attraction was set up, a message written in charcoal was found. "Why did you wake him up?" It was never cleaned, but the inscription vanished on its own. Counselors retelling the story mentioned that during those nights, a strange echo always filled the basement. Even a whisper would repeat 3 times, getting quieter each time, with the last echo sounding as if in a different voice. Since then, the basement has been closed. Yet, children still say that if you press your ear to the door and say your name, you can hear it being repeated. First, your voice, then someone else's, then no one calls. He just walks. Fact 95th. In Riga, in 1980, library staff began noticing that some books were spontaneously changing pages. The same novel would open to different chapters, regardless of bookmarks. Reference books contained paragraphs that hadn't been there before, strange descriptions of non-existent places, and dates matching future events. A librarian named Ilse wrote down a phrase from one such new page. "When he reads, the path will open. He reads with another's eyes." A week later, Ilse disappeared, leaving a book on her desk where the text consisted only of mirrored word fragments. An examination revealed the typographical ink was genuine, but no fingerprints were found on the pages. One reader mentioned feeling as if the letters were looking at him while reading certain books. Since then, part of the collection has been moved to a separate, restricted access archive. A note is still attached to the shelf above its entrance. You read, he rewrites. Fact 96th. In 1993, in the city of Tula, a 9th grader found an old record player with an unmarked record in an abandoned garage. Upon deciding to listen, he heard not music but noise, like the rustling of clothes and quiet footsteps. After about 30 seconds, someone began to slowly pronounce his name, stretching the vowels. The recording ended with a sharp sound, like a blow. The boy told his friends about it. One of them decided to record the record onto a cassette, but the tape recorder broke. A third friend claimed he started seeing a man in a hat in shop window reflections. A week later, the boy disappeared. A new inscription appeared on the record player, scratched with a needle directly onto the plastic. "He's out." The device was sent for examination, but soon disappeared from storage. One of the investigators wrote in his diary years later, "Now it plays without sound. Listen not with your ears." This diary was found at the site where another teenager went missing, and on the garage wall an imprint reappeared, a circle and the shadow of a thin hand. Fact 97th. In 1962, in Kiev, a watchmaker discovered that one of the pocket chronometers in his workshop began to lag by exactly 9 seconds every day, without exception. He attempted to repair it, replacing parts, but everything returned to the same state. A month later, the craftsman noticed that each time the clock stopped, the workshop became quieter than usual. Even the street noise was not audible. One day, he stayed overnight. At dawn, neighbors saw that the workshop window was fogged up from the inside, and there were clear fingerprints on the glass. The watchmaker himself disappeared. Only the clock remained on his workbench. It showed a time exactly 9 seconds behind the standard. Several years later, other watchmakers who took over the premises complained that the hands of the clock in the corner of the room sometimes started moving on their own, backward. And when this happened, someone stood in the mirror hanging opposite. The face was indistinguishable, but the hands were always gloved and always 9 seconds closer. Fact 98th. In 2002, in Yekaterinburg, in an apartment on the 6th floor, strange electrical failures began to occur. The light would flicker only at precisely 3:11 a.m. The apartment owner installed a surveillance camera, and the recording revealed that at this moment, the reflection of a figure standing in the kitchen appeared in the bathroom mirror. The kitchen was empty at that time. He removed the mirror. A day later, moisture appeared on the new bathroom tiles in the shape of a silhouette. A local electrician checking the wiring noticed that the wires in the walls seemed melted, but only in the bathroom and kitchen areas. He said, "This happens when someone walks through currents." A week later, the apartment owner moved out. The new resident, 2 nights later, complained of hearing someone tapping their fingers on the light switch. However, the light did not respond. An hour later, it was 3:11 a.m. again. The light went out. On the camera, the last frame showed a face pressed against the lens from the inside of the screen, and a caption that appeared later read, "I was just watching, you opened." Fact 99th. In 1974, in Tomsk, a chemistry student conducted an experiment with a developer found in an old laboratory cabinet. The chemical was unmarked, but when added to a standard photographic liquid, the pictures began to develop with images that were not in the frame. A photo of a regular classroom showed silhouettes that no one remembered. One shot revealed a dark figure standing behind glass where there was a solid wall. The student continued his experiments, but began to complain of feeling a gaze from the pictures. 2 weeks later, he did not attend classes. In his dormitory room, only photographic film was found, hung on the walls. Each frame showed the same corridor, shot as if from the ceiling, as if the photographer himself was hanging. The last frame was blank, just white, with a barely noticeable inscription, "Now you are developed." No one could identify the chemical. All the pictures disappeared from the archive a year later. Since then, no developer has worked in the laboratory. The paper remains clean, but shadows sometimes appear on its reverse side. Fact 100. In 1989, in Leningrad, a door leading nowhere was found in the basement of a closed museum. The other side was a wall. The door itself was covered with black fabric and had a bronze handle. Above it was a plaque with no letters, only 3 horizontal scratches. One of the restorers, trying to examine the structure, heard someone knock 3 times from the other side. The stone was solid. There was no wall. The next morning, letters appeared on the plaque that hadn't been there before. "You knocked." The other staff insisted on sealing it, but the seals were broken every night. On the 3rd day, a voice was heard from inside the door, mimicking one of the employees' speech, but with a distorted accent. Surveillance cameras recorded only darkness, as if a shadow entered the room. A week later, the restorer disappeared. A new plaque was left on the door. "One entered, one will leave." Years later, the museum reopened, but that basement is now locked. It is listed in the inventory as non-exit transition, whatever that means.